The colony was called Aldergrove, a name that sounded softer than the place truly was. It sat on the outer edge of a mid-sized American town, far enough from the city's noise to feel private, yet close enough to never be forgotten. The houses were uniform in distance, but not in personality, each separated by trimmed hedges and careful silence. Nothing about Aldergrove appeared threatening. That was its greatest deception. Caleb Monroe arrived on a Thursday afternoon with his wife, Eliza, and the last of their belongings packed into a rented truck. The move was supposed to mark a reset, a clean turn after years of drifting between apartments and temporary plans. Caleb had recently accepted a position that demanded stability, and Eliza had long wanted a place that felt rooted. Aldergrove seemed to offer that promise without asking questions. Their house stood at the corner of Juniper Lane, painted a muted cream with a narrow porch and a tall maple tree leaning slightly toward the driveway. It was not remarkable, but it felt intentional, as if it had been waiting for someone specific to live inside it. Eliza noticed that immediately. Caleb did not. The first afternoon passed quietly. Boxes were stacked, furniture placed loosely, windows open to let the late summer air in. Neighbors observed from behind curtains and garage doors, curiosity wrapped in politeness. A few nods were exchanged. A man mowing his lawn raised 2 fingers in greeting. A woman walking a dog slowed slightly as she passed. Nothing lingered long enough to be remembered. Across the hedge to the east stood the Hartwell house. It was darker than the others, a charcoal exterior with white trim that looked freshly maintained but rarely used. The curtains were always half drawn, even during daylight. A small garden sat untouched near the fence, flowers planted with care but never fully blooming. It was the kind of house that suggested presence without participation. Caleb noticed it only because he noticed movement. From the second-floor window, a figure appeared briefly and then vanished. It happened so quickly that he dismissed it as a reflection or shadow. He returned to unloading boxes, his mind occupied with logistics and fatigue. He did not look again. That evening, Eliza stood in the kitchen preparing a simple meal, her movements careful, her energy subdued. She had been quiet since the move began, not unhappy, but observant. She sensed spaces before they revealed themselves. Caleb assumed it was exhaustion. As the sun dipped lower, casting long orange streaks across the backyards, the figure from the Hartwell house emerged again. This time, she stepped outside. She moved with deliberate slowness, barefoot on the wooden deck, wearing a light dress that caught the wind without resisting it. Her hair fell loosely around her shoulders, dark against her pale skin. She did not look toward Caleb's house at first. She simply stood there, breathing in the evening. Caleb paused. He told himself it was natural to notice, new place, new surroundings, but his attention stayed longer than necessary. Something about her presence felt composed, rehearsed, as though she knew exactly how she appeared from a distance. When she finally turned her head, her gaze met his with precision rather than surprise. She did not smile. She acknowledged him with her eyes alone, holding the moment just long enough to make it intentional, then turned away and stepped back inside. Caleb felt unsettled, though he could not explain why. There had been no interaction, no exchange of words, no invitation, yet the moment lingered, pressing itself into his awareness like a thought that refused to be dismissed. Later that night, as the house settled into unfamiliar quiet, Caleb lay awake beside Eliza. The room smelled faintly of cardboard and new paint. Eliza slept facing away from him, her breathing slow and even. He watched the ceiling, listening to the hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustle from outside. At some point, he became aware of light. It came from the Hartwell house. The upstairs window glowed softly, steady and patient, as if someone were awake and waiting. Caleb did not rise to look, but the knowledge of it made his chest tighten. He turned toward Eliza, seeking comfort in familiarity, but sleep did not come easily. The following days unfolded with deceptive normalcy. Caleb began his new job. Eliza explored the house, organizing spaces, making lists, planting herbs along the porch. The colony revealed its rhythms slowly. Garbage bins rolled out on Tuesday mornings. Children rode bicycles in looping patterns every afternoon. Evenings brought the sound of televisions and laughter muffled through walls. And every evening, the woman from the Hartwell house appeared. Sometimes she stood near the hedge, pretending to tend to the neglected flowers. Other times she sat on the back steps, knees drawn close, watching the sky darken. She never waved, she never crossed the boundary, but her awareness was constant, and it always found Caleb. He learned her name indirectly. A delivery truck stopped at the Hartwell house one afternoon, and the driver left a package on the porch. The label was visible from Caleb's side of the yard. The name printed in neat black letters read, Mara Hartwell. That night, Caleb found himself thinking about the name without reason. It repeated quietly in his thoughts, detached from intention, from desire. He did not tell Eliza about the woman next door. There seemed no need. Nothing had happened. Yet something had begun. The first real interaction occurred on a Sunday morning. Caleb was alone in the backyard, adjusting a loose fence panel, when he sensed someone nearby. Mara stood on the other side of the hedge, close enough that he could see the texture of her skin, the subtle tension in her posture. She did not pretend to be occupied. She simply existed there, watching him with a calm intensity that felt invasive without being aggressive. Her presence altered the space between them. She leaned slightly forward, resting her hand on the top of the hedge, fingers brushing the leaves. Her eyes moved over Caleb with careful attention, as though cataloging details rather than admiring them. There was no warmth in her expression, but there was interest, sharp and focused. Caleb felt exposed. The moment passed without acknowledgement. She stepped back, turned, and disappeared into her house as quietly as she had come. The silence that followed was louder than any conversation could have been. That evening, Eliza mentioned feeling unsettled in the house. She could not name the reason. She attributed it to adjustment, to unfamiliar sounds and unfamiliar nights. Caleb agreed, offering reassurance he did not fully feel. Across the hedge, the Hartwell house remained dark. Until midnight. A single light turned on upstairs, steady and unmistakable. Caleb did not look, but he knew. Somewhere inside that house, Mara was awake, and whatever had drawn his attention to him had not faded with daylight. It had only learned patience. Monday arrived with a dull certainty of routine, and routine was exactly what Caleb Monroe needed. He left early, returned late, and tried to stitch his mind to practical things. Deadlines, traffic, grocery lists, the awkward geometry of a new home. Alder Grove looked the same each day, trimmed lawns and polite driveways, yet it felt as if the colony was learning him in silence, measuring the way he moved through it. Eliza filled the house with intention. She placed framed photos on shelves, lined pantry jars in steady rows, and wiped counters that were already clean. Her effort had the urgency of someone building a wall against something she could not see. She spoke less than usual, not coldly, not angrily, but with a mild distance, as though her thoughts were always half a room away. Caleb noticed, and he tried to compensate with small kindnesses. He carried heavier boxes without being asked. He made coffee in the mornings. He touched her shoulder when passing behind her in the kitchen, a brief gesture of closeness meant to remind both of them why they had come. Eliza accepted these efforts with quiet gratitude, but her unease did not lift. By midweek, Caleb began to sense that the colony had its own rules, spoken without words. Neighbors greeted from a distance but rarely stopped. Smiles arrived quickly and vanished just as fast. People watched each other without appearing to. Even the children seemed trained to stay within invisible lines, their laughter cutting off when an adult turned toward them. And the Hartwell house remained its own separate law. Mara Hartwell appeared like a scheduled event. She stepped outside in the late afternoon with the same controlled calm, as if the hours were designed around her presence. Sometimes she watered the half-blooming garden. Sometimes she carried a small tray of something from the kitchen to the back deck, never eating, only holding it for a moment before going inside. Her movements were never rushed. She gave the impression of someone who had nowhere to be, yet chose every second carefully. Caleb told himself he was imagining patterns, looking for meaning because the move had unsettled him. But the tension he felt when she was near was real, physical, a slight tightening behind the ribs, a sensitivity to sound, to air. One evening, as he pulled into the driveway, he saw her standing at the edge of her yard, closer than she had ever been to the hedge. She wore a soft cardigan over a sleeveless dress, her hair pinned loosely with strands falling free. The light from the lowering sun gave her face a warm glow that made her look almost familiar, as if he had known her somewhere else in another life. She did not approach him. She simply turned her head and watched him walk to his door. Caleb felt the irrational urge to look back again once inside, as though she might still be there, still watching, but he did not. He went in, set down his keys, and forced himself into the rhythm of dinner and small talk with Eliza. He tried to keep his focus on the life they had chosen. Yet later, when Eliza stepped upstairs to shower, Caleb wandered into the kitchen and looked out the back window without thinking. Mara stood at her upstairs window. The light behind her was dim, but her silhouette was sharp. Her face was visible, angled slightly downward, her gaze aimed toward Caleb's house with deliberate precision. She was not looking vaguely into the night, she was looking at him. Caleb froze, then stepped back from the window as though caught doing something wrong. When Eliza came downstairs, he was already pretending to read something on his phone. His heartbeat took longer than it should have to slow. The next day brought the first direct disruption. Caleb returned home earlier than usual, surprising even himself by the relief he felt at the thought of a quiet evening. Eliza had gone out to pick up a few things for the house. The place was empty, and the air inside carried that strange, new home smell that still hadn't softened into familiarity. Caleb stepped out back to check the fence again. The loose panel had been bothering him, and fixing it felt like a way to fix something larger. As he worked, he heard the sound of a gate opening. He turned. Mara Hartwell was in her yard, walking toward the hedge with the steadiness of someone who had already decided the distance between them meant nothing. She held a small object in one hand, something that looked like a folded cloth or a small envelope. Her other hand hung relaxed by her side. Caleb stood upright, wiping dust from his palms. Mara stopped at the hedge and looked at him long enough to tilt the moment into discomfort. Her eyes were dark, not simply in color, but in depth, as though they held more information than they should. There was a faint mark near her wrist, a pale line that might have been an old scar, visible only because her sleeve slipped back slightly. She raised the object in her hand, held it up, and placed it carefully on top of the hedge, as though leaving something at a border crossing. Caleb stared at it, then at her. Mara's expression remained calm, almost clinical, not seductive in the obvious way, not smiling or performing, but the control in her posture, the way she occupied space, carried a different kind of attraction, one built from certainty rather than charm. She withdrew her hand and stepped back. Then she turned and walked away without hesitation, returning to her house without hesitation. Caleb hesitated only a moment before stepping closer and taking the item from the hedge. It was a piece of fabric, soft and dark, folded neatly. When he unfolded it, he realized it was a handkerchief with a delicate stitched pattern at one corner, something too personal to be random. It smelled faintly of a perfume that was not sweet, not floral, but sharp and clean, like cold air over stone. Caleb's first instinct was to return it. His second instinct was to hide it. Caleb stood in the yard with the handkerchief in his hands, feeling the absurdity of how quickly something simple could become dangerous. He folded it again and slipped it into his pocket, telling himself he would return it later, when Eliza was home, when there was nothing secretive about it. But the secret existed the moment he chose to keep it. That night, he placed the handkerchief in a drawer in the kitchen, under old manuals and spare batteries, as though hiding it among meaningless things. Eliza returned with groceries and spoke about the store being oddly empty for Thursday. She mentioned noticing a police car driving slowly through the colony. She mentioned a missing cat poster pinned near the mailbox cluster, a photo of a gray tabby with wide eyes. Caleb nodded, pretending to care. He did not tell her about Mara. He did not tell her about the handkerchief, and the omission sat between them at dinner like an extra plate no one acknowledged. Over the next few days, the colony showed small signs of something shifting beneath its surface. A neighbor down the street replaced their porch light with a brighter one. A man Caleb had seen jogging every morning stopped appearing. The missing cat poster gained a second copy. Someone wrote something in black marker near the bottom, only a few words, too faint to read from a distance. Eliza noticed these things and grew quieter. Caleb noticed them and grew more alert, and Mara remained the most consistent element of all. On Saturday afternoon, Caleb found himself alone again. Eliza had gone to a local craft market she'd heard about from a neighbor, hoping to feel connected to something. Caleb stayed home under the excuse of catching up on work, though he did not open his laptop. The day was warm, but not humid, the kind of late summer weather that made everything feel suspended. Caleb stepped into the backyard to water the herbs Eliza had planted. He knelt, adjusted the hose, and tried to let his mind empty. A soft sound came from the other side of the hedge, like footsteps on dry grass. He did not look immediately. He pretended to focus on the plants until he felt her presence close enough to change the air. Then he turned. Mara stood there again, at the hedge, this time with her hands empty. Her hair was down fully, falling over her shoulders in a way that looked effortless but too perfect to be accidental. She wore a simple top and jeans, nothing dramatic, yet the simplicity sharpened her into something harder to ignore. She seemed less like a neighbor and more like a figure inserted into the colony for a purpose. Caleb remained kneeling for a moment, then rose. Mara's gaze moved slowly over him, not with hunger but with analysis, as though he was a puzzle she was certain she could solve. She leaned closer to the hedge, close enough that Caleb could see faint freckles along her cheek, the subtle tension at the edge of her jaw. Then, for the first time, she did something that looked like softness. She lifted her hand and brushed her fingers against the top leaves of the hedge, a small gesture that suggested intimacy without contact. Her eyes held his, steady and unblinking. Caleb felt a heat rise in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. He wanted to step back. He also wanted to step forward. Mara shifted her weight slightly, and her mouth formed words, silent from where he stood but clearly spoken. He could not hear her over the distance and the hush of the neighborhood, but he understood the meaning by the shape of it. She wanted him to come closer. Caleb took a step, almost without deciding. His fingers touched the hedge as well, mirroring her gesture, separated by only inches of leaves. Mara's eyes softened further, not into kindness, but into something more dangerous, permission. Then she glanced briefly toward Caleb's back door, toward the empty house, and back to him again. The message was clear, even without sound. This was a moment offered. Caleb's breath caught. He did not cross. He did not reach through, but he remained there, close enough that the boundary felt thin, close enough that the idea of touching her became a physical thought. Mara held the moment for several seconds, long enough for it to take root, then stepped back again, ending it cleanly as though she controlled the beginning and the end. She turned away. Before she disappeared, she paused and looked over her shoulder at him one last time, her expression unreadable. Then she went inside. Caleb remained standing at the hedge long after she was gone, feeling as though he had been pulled toward the edge of something and had barely stopped himself from falling. When Eliza returned later that evening, she looked tired but pleased, carrying small handmade items and a faint smile that didn't fully reach her eyes. She asked Caleb how his day had been. He told her it was quiet. He washed his hands at the sink and caught his own reflection in the window glass, his face tense, eyes sharper than usual. Across the hedge, the Hartwell house lights turned on one by one, slow and deliberate. And near midnight, Caleb found something else. A small piece of paper slid under his back door. No one knocked, no one announced themselves. The paper was blank on one side. On the other, written in neat, careful handwriting, was a simple instruction. A location, a time, and a name. It was Mara's. Caleb stood with the note in his hand, the house silent behind him, Eliza asleep upstairs, the colony outside holding its breath. He did not know how Mara had managed to leave it without being seen. He did not know why his hands were shaking. He only knew that the story had shifted. The attraction was no longer distant. It had become an invitation, and invitations in Alder Grove did not come without cost. The note remained in Caleb Monroe's pocket for hours before he allowed himself to read it again. He stood in the kitchen long after midnight, the house quiet except for the refrigerator's low hum and the distant murmur of traffic beyond the colony. Eliza slept upstairs, unaware that the air inside their home had shifted into something thinner, less forgiving. The paper was ordinary, torn from something unremarkable. The handwriting was not rushed, not dramatic. It was precise, controlled, as if written by someone accustomed to being obeyed without force. A location on the edge of town, a time just before dusk the following evening, and her name. Nothing else, no explanation, no reassurance. Caleb folded the note carefully and placed it back in his pocket. He did not decide anything in that moment. He told himself that acknowledging the choice was not the same as making it. The next day moved slowly, every hour stretched by anticipation that Caleb refused to name. At work, he struggled to focus, numbers blurred together, meetings passed without memory. He checked the time more often than he should have, then felt ashamed for doing so. The idea of the meeting occupied a space in his mind that grew larger the more he tried to push it away. Eliza sensed the shift immediately. She did not confront him, she did not ask questions. Instead, she watched him with the same quiet observation she had been practicing since their arrival, noting the way his attention drifted, the way his body seemed half-turned, even when he faced her directly. She busied herself with small tasks, rearranging items that did not need rearranging, keeping motion between them like a buffer. That evening, she suggested dinner earlier than usual, a subtle attempt to anchor the night. Caleb agreed, forcing himself into normalcy, answering her casual remarks with careful neutrality. He smiled when expected. He listened when spoken to. He told himself that if he could just get through the night without leaving the house, the pull would weaken. But Alder Grove had its own timing. As the sun lowered, painting the colony in warm gold that softened even its sharpest edges, Caleb felt the pressure return. It was not desire in the traditional sense. It was curiosity sharpened into need, a sense that something was being withheld deliberately and that refusing to retrieve it would cost more than retrieving it ever could. When Eliza excused herself to take a call from her sister upstairs, Caleb stood alone in the living room. The clock on the wall marked the passing minutes with soft certainty. The time written on the note approached. Caleb moved before he finished thinking. He left the house quietly, closing the door with deliberate care. The evening air felt heavier than usual, thick with the scent of cut grass and distant rain. The street was quiet, most neighbors indoors, windows glowing softly. No one watched him leave, yet he felt observed all the same. He did not look toward the Hartwell house. He followed the directions from the note, driving past the edge of the colony and into a part of town that felt forgotten rather than abandoned. The road narrowed, streetlights grew sparse, houses gave way to trees and uneven sidewalks. The place Mara had chosen was an old municipal overlook near a dried riverbed, a remnant from a time when the town had tried to build something scenic and then lost interest. Caleb parked and stepped out of the car. The air here was cooler, the light dimmer. The overlook sat above the riverbed like a paused thought, its concrete railing cracked but intact. Weeds pushed through the pavement, a bench leaned slightly to one side, unused. Mara stood near the railing, facing away from him. She wore a darker coat than he had seen before, fitted and simple, blending into the evening rather than standing apart from it. Her hair was tied back loosely, exposing the line of her neck. She did not turn when he approached. She had known he would come. Caleb stopped several steps away, unsure how close was acceptable. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of wind moving through dry grass below. Mara turned slowly. Her expression held no surprise, no triumph, only acknowledgement, as if his presence confirmed something she already understood. She looked at him for a long moment, then shifted her gaze past him, scanning the empty overlook. Satisfied, she stepped closer, closing the distance without urgency. The air between them tightened, charged with something that felt heavier than attraction. Caleb became acutely aware of his own breathing, of the sound his shoes made on the concrete, of the fact that he was alone with her and a place chosen for isolation. Mara raised one hand and touched his arm lightly, just above the elbow. The contact was brief, almost clinical, yet it sent a sharp awareness through him. She did not linger. She did not test boundaries slowly. She made contact and withdrew, as if to confirm that the boundary existed and could be crossed. She moved around him, circling slightly, her presence close enough to feel without fully seeing. Caleb resisted the urge to turn with her, to track her movements like a prey animal. He forced himself to remain still. When she stopped, she stood behind him, close enough that he could sense her warmth through the thin space between them. She leaned forward, her breath brushing his ear without touching it. The proximity was deliberate, intimate in a way that did not require words. Caleb's hands clenched at his sides. Mara stepped away again, returning to face him. Her eyes searched his, not for reassurance, but for alignment, as though she needed to know whether he was capable of understanding what she was about to offer. She reached into her coat pocket and removed another folded paper, thicker than the first. She placed it into his hand and closed his fingers around it before he could look. The contact lasted longer this time. Her skin was warm, steady. Then she released him and stepped back. Caleb unfolded the paper slowly. It was not a note this time. It was a map, hand-drawn with careful precision. Streets, landmarks, paths through Alder Grove that were not official, shortcuts that did not appear on any public record. The Hartwell house was marked, so was his. Several other houses were circled. A date was written in the corner, weeks earlier than his arrival. Caleb looked up at her, confusion rising alongside something colder. Mara watched him closely, her face unreadable. She gestured toward the map, then toward the darkened town beyond the overlook. The implication was clear enough without explanation. This place had patterns, this colony had rules, and Caleb and Eliza had not arrived randomly. Mara stepped closer again, her expression softening into something that almost resembled vulnerability. She placed her hand against his chest, over his heartbeat, and left it there, grounding and invasive at once. Her eyes held his, steady and intent. For a moment, the tension between them shifted into something else. The proximity, the quiet, the isolation combined into a dangerous intimacy. Caleb felt the urge to pull her closer, to collapse the distance entirely, to turn the unease into something simpler and more human. Mara seemed to sense it. She leaned in, close enough that her forehead nearly touched his. Her breath was slow, controlled. Her presence filled his senses, pushing everything else to the periphery. Then she stepped back abruptly. The change was jarring. She shook her head once subtly, as though correcting a miscalculation. She took another step away, restoring distance, restoring control. The intimacy evaporated, leaving behind a sharper awareness of the stakes. Mara turned toward the riverbed and pointed downward. Caleb followed her gaze. Below, partially hidden by shadow and brush, was something that did not belong. A structure half buried in the dried riverbed, concrete walls exposed at odd angles, like the remains of an unfinished underground space. It looked old, abandoned, deliberately forgotten. Mara looked back at him and then at the map again, her finger tracing a path that led from Alder Grove to the structure below. She met his eyes one last time. Then she stepped away, walking toward the path that led down from the overlook. She stopped after a few steps, waiting without turning back. Caleb hesitated. The weight of the moment pressed in on him, heavy and undeniable. He thought of Eliza, asleep in their house, trusting the safety of walls that might not protect her. He thought of the map, of the circled houses, of the date that predated his arrival. And he thought of the way Mara had looked at him, not as a temptation, but as a chosen variable. Caleb followed her. They descended the uneven path in silence, the sound of gravel underfoot echoing too loudly in the stillness. The structure grew clearer as they approached, its concrete walls marked with stains and cracks, the entrance partially collapsed but still accessible. Mara stopped at the edge of the opening. She turned to face him, her expression stripped of all softness now. This was the truest version of her he had seen yet, focused, determined, burdened with knowledge. She reached out and took his hand, not gently, firmly. She placed his hand against the rough concrete wall, grounding him in the reality of the place. Then she released him and stepped inside the darkness without hesitation. Caleb stood at the threshold, heart pounding, aware that crossing it would change something fundamental. Behind him, the town lay quiet and distant. Ahead of him, the unknown waited with deliberate patience. And somewhere back in Alder Grove, Eliza slept, unaware that the life they had chosen was already unraveling. Caleb stepped into the darkness. The darkness inside the structure was not absolute, but it was deliberate. Faint light filtered through narrow cracks where concrete had shifted over time, thin slashes of gray cutting through the black like hesitant thoughts. The air was cooler here, carrying the scent of damp stone and old neglect. Caleb's footsteps echoed despite his effort to move quietly, the sound bouncing off walls that felt closer than they should have been. Mara moved ahead of him without hesitation. She navigated the uneven floor as if she had walked this path many times before. Her silhouette slipped between patches of dim light, steady and assured. Caleb followed, aware that every step forward increased the distance between himself and the life he had known only hours earlier. The structure revealed itself gradually. It was not a single room, but a sequence of connected chambers, each partially collapsed, each showing signs of having once served a purpose. Rusted fixtures protruded from the walls, faded paint peeled in long strips. Old electrical conduits ran along the ceiling, cut and abandoned. This place had been built with intention and then erased from memory. Mara stopped near the center of the largest chamber. She gestured toward the walls. Caleb moved closer, his eyes adjusting to the low light. He noticed markings etched into the concrete, dates, initials, symbols that repeated with subtle variation. Some names were scratched shallowly, others carved deep enough to suggest desperation. The markings formed clusters, patterns that hinted at order rather than chaos. He recognized one of the dates. It matched the date written on the map. Caleb felt a slow chill creep through him. Mara walked along the wall, her fingers tracing the carvings without touching them, as though proximity alone was enough. She stopped at one cluster and turned toward him. Her expression was not fearful, not mournful. It was resolute, edged with something that looked like obligation. Caleb understood then that she had not brought him here to seduce him. She had brought him here to show him something. He moved along the wall, reading what he could. The names were unfamiliar, yet there was something unsettling about how many there were. Some had been crossed out, others circled. A few had additional marks beside them, lines, arrows, symbols that mirrored those on the map. At the far end of the chamber, partially hidden behind a fallen slab of concrete, Caleb noticed a metal cabinet embedded into the wall. Its door hung slightly open, rusted but intact. Mara approached it and pulled the door wider with effort. Inside were folders, paper, yellowed and brittle, stacked carefully despite the decay around them. Mara removed one and placed it into Caleb's hands. The pages inside were reports, old municipal documents, planning permits, incident logs. Caleb recognized the formatting immediately, official language, precise phrasing, the kind of writing meant to record facts while concealing implications. The documents spoke of Alder Grove's early development, of zoning decisions made quietly, of a community safety initiative that had required off-site facilities. References to the riverbed appeared repeatedly, coded as infrastructure support. Then the tone shifted. Reports of disturbances, reports of disappearances, residents who had left suddenly, families who had moved away without forwarding addresses, incidents described as personal choices, mental health crises, voluntary departures. The names matched the wall. Caleb's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. Mara watched him closely, gauging his reaction, waiting for understanding to form. When he reached the final pages, she stepped closer and pointed to a paragraph near the bottom. The report described an experiment without calling it one, a study of influence, attraction, destabilization, the belief that certain interpersonal dynamics could be engineered to expose vulnerabilities, to fracture households quietly, to remove individuals without drawing attention. The colony had been designed not just as housing, but as a controlled environment. Alder Grove was not meant to hold people, it was meant to filter them. Caleb looked up slowly. Mara nodded once, a small confirmation of something she had been carrying alone. She gestured toward herself, then toward the wall, then toward the map still folded in Caleb's pocket. The meaning aligned with sudden clarity. She was not an outsider. She was a constant. Mara Hartwell had not arrived recently. She had been placed, or she had volunteered, or she had survived long enough to become part of the mechanism. Caleb thought of his husband, the name Hartwell printed on the package label. He had never seen the man. He had never seen anyone else enter or leave that house. Mara turned away and walked deeper into the chamber, stopping near a narrow doorway that led into darkness beyond. She hesitated there for the first time since entering, her posture tightening slightly. Caleb followed. The room beyond was smaller, lower ceilinged and colder. A single overhead fixture hung uselessly from the ceiling. The floor sloped downward, uneven and cracked. Along one wall were remnants of restraints, metal loops bolted into the concrete, corroded but unmistakable. Caleb felt his stomach tighten. Mara stood very still, her back to him. For a moment, the controlled certainty she carried fractured. Her shoulders dropped slightly. The air around her seemed heavier. She turned slowly. Her expression now held something raw, exhaustion layered beneath discipline. She placed her hand over a carved name near the doorway. The name was not crossed out. Caleb understood without explanation. This place had taken something from her, and it had not finished. She stepped closer to him, her movements slower, more deliberate than before. She reached out and pressed the map flat against his chest, holding it there. Her eyes locked onto his, searching not for desire, but for resolution. Caleb felt the weight of what she was asking. She was not inviting him into an affair. She was recruiting him. She stepped back and gestured upward, toward the invisible line where the underground ended and the colony began. Then she gestured toward him, then toward his house, then made a cutting motion across the map. The message was clear. Something was coming, and Eliza was now within its range. The realization struck Caleb with sharp clarity. The attraction, the attention, the calculated proximity, none of it had been random. It had been a test, a trigger, a way to see how easily his life could be destabilized. Mara intervened, not to cause the fracture, but to redirect it. She moved toward the exit without waiting for him, confident that he would follow. They climbed back up in silence, emerging into the cool night air. The town lights glowed in the distance, innocent and distant. From here, Alder Grove looked peaceful, undistinguishable from any other quiet American neighborhood. Mara stopped near the top of the path. She turned toward him one last time, her face lit faintly by the distant streetlights. She placed her hand against his chest again, over his heartbeat, but this time the gesture was grounding rather than intimate. Then she reached up and brushed her fingers lightly against his cheek, a brief, almost tender motion that carried no promise. Then she stepped away. She walked back toward the darkness, toward the path that would lead her home, leaving Caleb alone at the overlook. He remained there long after she disappeared, the map still warm against his chest, the weight of knowledge pressing in from all sides. When he finally returned home, the house was quiet. Eliza slept upstairs, turned toward the door this time, her expression peaceful and unguarded. Caleb stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching her, seeing her not just as his wife, but as someone unknowingly placed within a system designed to dismantle stability. He did not wake her. He lay beside her and stared at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, now stripped of their comfort. Across the hedge, the Hartwell house remained dark. For the first time since arriving in Alder Grove, Caleb hoped it stayed that way. But hope, he was beginning to understand, had never been part of the colony's design. The morning arrived without ceremony, as though Alder Grove itself wished to appear innocent. Sunlight slid across the hedges and rooftops with practiced ease. Birds returned to their routines. Porch lights switched off. The colony performed normalcy flawlessly. Caleb Monroe did not sleep. He lay beside Eliza through the night, aware of every shift in her breathing, every small movement that confirmed her safety. The knowledge he carried refused rest. It pressed against his thoughts with steady insistence, reshaping familiar details into warnings he could no longer ignore. By morning, he understood the final truth. Alder Grove did not remove people through force. It dismantled them from within. The fractures were quiet, attraction where there should have been trust, doubt where there should have been certainty, distance where there should have been intimacy. Once the structure weakened, removal happened naturally. People left, people vanished. The colony absorbed the silence and continued. Caleb rose before Eliza woke and moved through the house with care, memorizing it as though preparing to leave it behind. He opened drawers, cabinets, closets, searching not for objects, but for signs. Nothing was obvious. That, too, was part of the design. Outside, a subtle shift had already begun. A police vehicle moved slowly through Juniper Lane. 2 unfamiliar cars sat parked near the mailbox cluster. The missing cat posters had multiplied overnight, now taped neatly to nearly every post. The black marker writing was clearer in the morning light. Not lost, replaced. Caleb felt the words settle into him with cold precision. Across the hedge, the Hartwell house stood unchanged, curtains drawn, no movement. It was as if Mara had been erased again, returned to her role as absence rather than presence. Eliza came downstairs shortly after, her expression calm, untroubled. She spoke about errands she planned to run, about wanting to look at a different grocery store farther from the colony. She mentioned feeling restless, as though something about Alder Grove no longer fit. Caleb listened carefully. The system was already testing her. He understood then that staying silent would not protect her. Silence was what the colony depended on. The longer he allowed patterns to form, the harder it would be to break them. The choice before him was not between truth and comfort. It was between damage and escape. By noon, the colony shifted again. A moving truck arrived 2 streets down, another family leaving without ceremony. No farewell, no gathering, just boxes and closed doors. Neighbors watched from behind windows, their expressions unreadable. The system resetting itself. Caleb felt the urgency sharpen. He left the house under the pretense of checking the mailbox. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the colony, following the paths marked on Mara's map. The shortcuts revealed themselves easily once he knew to look for them. Worn patches of grass, gaps in fencing, alleys that led nowhere official, but everywhere necessary. At the far edge of Alder Grove, near a line of trees that separated the colony from the rest of town, he found what the map had warned him about. A small structure disguised as a utility shed. Inside were cameras. Monitors displayed quiet angles of the colony, backyards, porches, windows. The images refreshed slowly, methodically. Nothing dramatic, nothing overtly criminal, just observation refined into control. One feed lingered longer than the others. His house. Caleb turned away, nausea rising. He did not destroy the equipment. That would have been noticed. Resistance here had to be surgical, not reactive. The system thrived on disruption. Escape required subtlety. He returned home and packed quietly, only essentials, documents, cash, clothing that would not draw attention. He left behind objects that rooted them to the house, framed photos, decorative pieces, anything that suggested permanence. He moved efficiently, his mind focused and clear in a way it had not been since arriving. Eliza noticed the bags only when he placed them near the door. Her confusion was immediate. Caleb did not soften the urgency. He did not dilute the truth. He laid out the reality carefully, avoiding unnecessary detail, but leaving no room for doubt. He spoke of patterns, of engineered fractures, of the way Alder Grove dismantled stability without ever appearing to act. Eliza listened. The skepticism Caleb feared never arrived. Instead, understanding did. She had felt it too, the unease, the sense of being watched, the way her thoughts had begun to drift toward doubt without cause, the way comfort had thinned into something fragile. She agreed without hesitation. They would leave that afternoon. By early evening, the house stood empty. Caleb and Eliza drove out of Alder Grove without looking back. The colony let them go without resistance, as it always did. Escape only mattered if it was noticed. Silence protected both sides. As they crossed the boundary where the trees thickened and the roads widened, Caleb felt the pressure ease slightly, like stepping out of a room with too little air. But the relief was incomplete. At a red light near the edge of town, Caleb glanced into the rearview mirror. A car followed them. Not close enough to be obvious, not far enough to be coincidence. The light changed. The car continued. Caleb kept driving. Hours later, they reached a small roadside motel far from Alder Grove. Caleb parked near the office, choosing visibility over comfort. Eliza sat on the bed while he stood near the window scanning the lot. The following car did not appear. That night, sleep came in fragments. Just before dawn, Caleb woke with certainty rather than fear. He stepped outside quietly and scanned the lot once more. At the far edge, partially obscured by shadow, stood a familiar figure. Mara Hartwell. She did not approach. She stood still, her posture relaxed but alert, as though confirming something had concluded properly. When Caleb met her gaze, she lifted one hand in acknowledgement, not farewell. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the thinning darkness. Caleb did not follow. He returned to the room and lay beside Eliza, the sound of passing trucks marking the return of ordinary life. They left the motel at sunrise. In the weeks that followed, Alder Grove faded into something that felt almost imagined. No one contacted them, no warnings arrived, no retaliation followed. The system did not chase those who escaped quietly. That was the final rule. Months later, Caleb passed a real estate listing online. Alder Grove. New homes available, safe, quiet, perfect for fresh starts. The listing photos showed trimmed hedges, clean porches, smiling neighbors. The Hartwell house stood in the background, dark and composed, its curtains half drawn. Caleb closed the listing. Some places were not meant to be exposed. They were meant to endure. And sometimes, survival was not about destroying the system. It was about leaving it before it learned how to keep you.